So today I wanted to get into one of the first videos that I'll make on how to organize your code. And in order to understand, good ways to organize your code, you really need to understand the concept of scope. And so scope is basically the concept of organizing your code into like blocks and nested blocks of code. So as an example, the outermost block of code is just the file in which your code lives. So here's like the outermost block of code. And then this is a function which we haven't talked about yet, but this defines another block of code because we have, these brackets here, and that means that we've got another block of code within this bigger block of code, and we can keep going. We can keep nesting these blocks of code. So if we make an if statement, for example, then there's another block nested within this block, nested within the outermost block, which is the file. We can do one more within this one. And so you see we've got our code sort of nested in these blocks. We've got the outermost, another one, go inward one more, and inward one more. And this is essentially the idea behind scope in your code. So we could actually replace the word block here with scope, and it would still make sense. So we've got the outermost scope, and then we've got the scope defined by this block of code. We've got another block, another scope, and then one more nested scope. And so I think beginning it's helpful to think of blocks and scope as kind of similar to each other. Now, this outermost scope actually has a special name, and we usually call it the global scope. And anything that you define in the global scope is accessible anywhere in the code. And that's actually a principle that carries over to all scopes, is that variables that you define in one scope can be accessed by anything within that scope. So if I define a variable up here, for example, so I'll just define a string. This string lives in the global scope, which means I can access it anywhere within this file. I can access it here in this scope, I can access it here within this one, and I can access it within this one as well. Now, what you can't do is access variables in a scope that's bigger than where you define the variable. So if I define a variable within here, then I'm able to access that within this block and within this block, but I can't access it out here. If I try to print it out here, you'll notice that it's going to give me an error, use of undeclared identifier. And that means that out here it doesn't know about the variable hey because it's defined within this scope. So going along with this idea of scopes is the idea of namespaces. And a namespace is basically just a name that you can give to a scope. I can define a namespace by using the keyword namespace. So then I can define a variable within this namespace. this. And so this now this variable is accessible within this namespace. So it's actually, so the namespace is defined in the global scope. So I can access the namespace from anywhere, but I can't access this variable from anywhere. So if I try to use it down here, for example, to print something, I am unable to do this. It's going to give me an error. Now, see, it actually gives me a suggestion to replace it, and this is actually the right thing to do. It asks if, did we mean my namespace : bar, and that's how you would access that variable. So you have to, so when you declare a namespace, you have to tell it the name of the namespace and then 2 colons and then the variable name. So if I run this code, it should just print my variable because we're accessing it through this namespace. And so you'll notice that we actually use this : syntax somewhere else in the code, and that's every time that we use a cout or string, and that's because these identifiers live in the namespace called std. So there: actually another keyword that we can use so that we don't have to be typing this std : all over the place, and that's called the using keyword. So if I say using namespace and then I tell it the name of the namespace that I want to use, I can, well, let me actually move this. I can actually get rid of all these std : parts, because now I've told the global scope that I want to just use the std namespace as part of my global scope. So now I'm able to omit std : and just type string and just type cout, and you'll see that this runs the exact same way. Anyway, there's not really a lot more to say about this concept of scopes and namespaces, but it is a really useful concept to know. And if you're having trouble understanding it, I would just play around with defining, blocks of code and just seeing where you can access different variables that you define. But yeah, I think that's all I've got for this video, and I will see you in the next one.